The soldier trudged across the scorched barley field, a place that once stretched green and endless in his youth. His worn boots scraped against the gravel, each dry crunch sounding too much like gunfire he'd been trying to forget. He wasn't dreaming of medals, never had. All he wanted was an embrace from the wife who'd waited 8 long years. But when he reached the gate, the light inside the house went out, and a gunshot cracked from the backyard. In that little town, late winter days always seemed to go dark quicker than you'd think. By 4:30, the sky was already sinking, pulling heavy gray clouds over it like slabs of stone. The rain didn't pour, but each cold drop was sharp enough to sneak past the collar, soak into your skin. Streetlights flicked on early, their thin yellow glow stretching over rain-sheen sidewalks, each falling drop making a small circle in the puddles before fading away like it had never been there at all. Mira walked slowly, measuring every brick under her shoes. The worn canvas heels were soaked through, giving off a tired, wet scrape. In her arms, her 3-year-old boy slept deep, his head slumped against her shoulder, breathing soft but steady. The blanket wrapped around him was so thin it hardly kept the chill out, so her hand curled tight on its edge, keeping the wind from finding its way in. Rain hit her hair, slid down her cheek, mixing with the faint warmth coming off the boy she carried. On either side, the shop windows mirrored them back. A thin woman and a small child, shadows moving past in a world headed somewhere else. A few people glanced, then looked away, like they were afraid if they kept their eyes on her a second too long, they might have to do something about it. Far off, an engine turned over, tires hissed on wet pavement. All of it blended into a cold kind of background noise, one that made the two of them seem even more alone in it. She stopped at the corner, under a street lamp. The light came down warm and gold, catching the rain on her hair and the faded gray blanket. The wind curled past, carrying the damp smell of old fabric and the faint breath of a sleeping child. For just a moment, looking at that little face, lips parted like he was dreaming of something safe, she felt a small, clear kind of joy, not because life had gotten better, but because he was still here, still breathing in her arms. That small joy lit something deeper, the need to protect. Not the vague, soft kind of need people talk about, but a hard, fixed resolve like the whole world could turn its back, but she wouldn't. Shoulders stiff from the cold, lifted straight, her steps steadier now. Every move she made wasn't just about crossing a rainy night, but about standing against whatever waited out there. An old bus rattled by, headlights sweeping over them, throwing their shadows long on the wet street. She watched it go, not to wave it down, but to measure the distance between her and the rest of the world. The wind it left behind made her pull the boy in closer, as if some invisible hand might try to take him. The street stretched ahead, small diners with flickering signs, steam spilling out of kitchen vents, mixing with the rain into a smell of grease, bread, and coffee. She kept walking, though the smell was a quiet reminder that warmth still existed somewhere, even if it didn't belong to her just yet. By the time she reached the end of the block, the lights had thinned, leaving patches of dark in between. She shifted the boy to her other arm, pulled the blanket higher with her free hand. Part of her wanted to duck under some awning, but another part pushed her forward, because stopping meant being seen, being asked, being forced to answer questions she had no intention of answering. The rain kept falling, but now she didn't walk like someone being pushed along by the cold wind. She moved like someone going forward on her own terms, each step carrying a quiet promise. This child will never know what it's like to be left standing alone in the rain, like I once was. And in the gray hum of that small town night, that promise rang louder than anything else. Her voice, if you could put it to sound, would be like smoke from damp wood, slow, curling through memory the way a winter river moves under ice. Mira had once been a soldier's wife. He didn't come home from the war, not because of some fierce battle, but because of a training accident, a small mistake no one bothered to write in detail in a report, yet big enough to take her whole world away. The day the news came, she was at the sink, rinsing glasses in their cramped kitchen, her hands smelling faintly of soap and lemon. The knock at the door wasn't loud, but it split her life into before and after. 3 men stood on the porch in uniform, their caps wet with rain, eyes trying to hold a formal line, but slipping with something closer to unease. Nobody wanted to say it, but one of them finally did, his words short and cold as a blade. After that, the room felt hollow, as if sound itself had left. The funeral came and went faster than she imagined. A folded flag laid on the coffin, the long cry of a trumpet, and wind sliding through the chairs, making people hunch their shoulders. Jamie could barely speak then, didn't know why his mother cried, only reached out his arms to be carried. She held him, both of them adrift in a sea of black coats. The wound had barely scabbed over when the next blow landed. Less than a week later, Walter, her father-in-law, asked Mira to come to his big wooden house at the edge of town. Inside still smelled of oak and cigar smoke, the same as those family dinners long ago. But that night, it made her chest feel tight. He sat behind his desk, a photo of his son set in front of him, saying everything without a word. The request to leave the house was delivered like a piece of official business, dry and precise. Mira heard herself answer evenly, though her hands gripped a handkerchief hard enough to leave marks in her palms. Walter didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger. He only said it was for the best, that she'd get a small stipend for a few months, enough to get settled. She knew it was his way of closing the door, so he wouldn't have to see the reminder of his loss every day. That night she packed. The house was so quiet she could hear the clock ticking on the wall. She took a few changes of clothes, one of Jamie's pillows, and a small framed picture of the three of them in the park the summer before. The rain was light when she stepped onto the porch with her son in her arms. The door behind her closed, not with a slam, but a soft click that somehow echoed longer in her head than any loud noise could. After that, the streets and the night became home. She learned which awnings kept the wind out, which cafes had kind managers who might hand her a leftover cup of cocoa, and which parts were safe enough for Jamie to run a little during the day. She kept away from the shelters, not out of pride, but because the stairs there were colder than any concrete floor in winter. Every night, she wrapped her boy in the thin blanket, holding him against her chest, listening to his steady breathing for some small measure of peace. She learned to sleep light, one ear open for strange footsteps. When Jamie coughed or ran a fever, she walked block after block just to find a pharmacy still open. By the time autumn slid into winter, she realized she couldn't remember what it felt like to be inside a warm house. Still, there were tiny moments that lit the dark. Jamie laughing when a raindrop landed on his nose, or his small hand finding her finger in the night. Little scraps of joy, enough to tell her that as long as he was with her, she'd keep walking, no matter how cold the street got. And then, like any story without an ending yet, one night their path crossed into the orbit of someone just back from a different kind of war, a man Mira would later learn carried the same emptiness in him, and the same hard vein of resolve. The rain that had been falling since early evening hadn't stopped, just thinned into fine threads that hung in the air and clung to the street like a layer of cold dust. Yellow light from the poles along the road stretched into long streaks across the slick asphalt, and whenever a car passed, its wheels stirred up a ripple of pale glow. Mira carried Jamie, her shoulders damp, hands numb but still holding the blanket tight around her son. The boy slept deeply, his breath warm and faint against her neck, a fragile sign that, for now, everything was still intact. They'd reached the end of the main street, busy by day with traders and shoppers, now left only with the stale scent of baked goods drifting from the corner shop and the wind threading through old metal signs. Mira was thinking about finding a familiar awning for the night when she heard footsteps ahead. Not fast, not urgent, but steady, someone walking toward them. Instinct made her pull Jamie closer, shifting so the blanket hid more of his face from a stranger's view. The man appeared under the circle of a streetlight. His dark coat was worn at the cuffs, and on his shoulder hung a faded army pack that looked like it had traveled with him through years and miles. His steps were unhurried, but sure. His face carried deep lines from time and distance, his eyes lowered slightly, as if holding a weight no one could see. He didn't look at Mira right away, only gave a small nod as they passed, like the silent greeting between people who've both crossed too many front lines. Mira started to quicken her pace, but a sudden gust whipped down the street, tearing the blanket from her shoulder. Jamie whimpered, his small hand groping in the cold air. The man stopped, bent to pick up the blanket, his hands large and weathered, his movements slow and careful. When he handed it back, his eyes paused on the boy's pale face. There was something there, not curiosity, not pity, but recognition. Mira gave a brief nod, taking the blanket. Her "thank you" was barely more than a breath. She walked on, but could feel his gaze lingering, not pressing, just quietly making sure they didn't disappear into the dark unnoticed. They met again a few blocks later. Mira had settled under an awning near the old post office, where the wall kept out most of the wind and the ground was drier than elsewhere. She just laid Jamie down and hadn't yet unwrapped her wet scarf when the man appeared, holding a steaming paper cup. He set it down at a respectful distance, not stepping into her space, and spoke slowly, his voice low and rough from cold and years lived out in the weather. Coffee, still warm. Mira looked at the cup, then at him. Part of her wanted to refuse, not out of fear, but from the habit of knowing nothing came for free. But Jamie stirred and gave a small cough, and she knew that right now, warmth in any form was a gift. She nodded, took it, and murmured another thank you. The man stepped back, leaning against the lamppost, eyes on the far end of the street. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It felt more like a second blanket laid over the night. Not enough to chase the cold away, but enough to keep the wind from cutting through. Mira took a small sip. The bitterness spread slowly, warming her throat. Beside her, Jamie slept deeper, his breathing even again. She realized something strange. This was the first night in months she didn't feel entirely alone on this street. When he left, she only heard the sound of his steps fading until they blended into the rain. She didn't know his name, didn't expect to see him again. But somewhere in the stillness of that night, a small seed was planted. The seed of belief that there were still people willing to stop, to notice, and to quietly protect without asking for anything in return. The night wind slid along the low rooftops of the town, slipping through door cracks, carrying the damp scent of old wood and rust. The rain had stopped, but water still streamed in thin threads from the gutters to the sidewalk, falling with the steady tick of a far-off clock. Under the awning of the abandoned post office, Mira leaned against the wall, the damp blanket wrapped tight around Jamie. He was still asleep, but not peacefully. Every so often she felt his small body curl in on itself, followed by a thin, rattling breath from his fragile chest. She pressed her hand to his forehead. The heat under her fingers was a familiar warning. Fever had started. Mira closed her eyes, drawing a slow breath, willing herself not to tremble. She'd lived through too many nights like this to believe panic could help. Still, inside her, fear curled tight like a small animal cornered. She thought back to just a few hours ago, when a stranger had handed her that cup of coffee. The warmth had led her believe, if only for a while, that this night might pass without turning into another fight against chills or coughs. But now, that fragile belief was fading under the weight of reality. Mira pulled Jamie closer, trying to share her own warmth with him, one arm shielding him from the wind. Footsteps came again, slow, steady, the same rhythm she'd heard earlier. The figure appeared under the yellow light, and this time, Mira didn't turn away. The man stopped, bending slightly as if to take measure of the scene. His eyes passed over Jamie's face, then, without asking or speaking, he opened his pack and pulled out an old army coat. Mira looked at it. Thick, smelling of cotton and smoke, and faintly of the metallic tang of old weapons. He set it down near her, his hand resting there a moment longer, as if to make sure she wouldn't refuse. Then he simply nodded, straightened up, and walked on into the dark. She hesitated for a few seconds, but when Jamie coughed again, she took the coat and wrapped it around him. Almost at once, the trembling eased, his breathing evened out. In the dark, she mouthed a silent thank you. The night was still long and cold, but not entirely empty. There were pauses in the wind where she could hear his breath mixing with her own, and farther off, as if echoing from another street, the memory of footsteps that had left behind a heavy coat in the middle of a cold night. She didn't know who he was, or if she'd see him again. But in the blood pulsing through her, she felt something sure. Even in a world full of loss, there were still hands that reached out without asking for anything back. And it was in moments that small, that fleeting, she found herself wanting to protect those rare bits of kindness, just as she was now trying to guard her son's fragile life in the cold, or as that stranger had left behind a piece of his own warmth without asking for more. The next morning, the town woke under a veil of mist, thin as a forgotten scarf draped over the low rooftops. It clung to fence posts, to flaking shop signs, and to the patch of ground in front of the abandoned post office, where Mira sat curled in on herself like a leaf caught in the wind. Jamie lay close beside her, his breathing less ragged now, but still weak. The thick army coat from the stranger wrapped around him, the smell of worn fabric mixing with the scent of a child's hair, making a fragile warmth that had been enough to see them through the night. Mira stayed there for a while, watching the slow trickle of people begin to appear. A few men headed to early shifts, an old woman tugged a small dog along. A couple of kids walked their bikes. Everyone moved quickly, their glances skimming over the mother and child without stopping. The only sound that stood apart was the steady thud of military boots at the far end of the street. Measured, certain, like each step was placed with thought before it landed. Ethan came into view at the corner, tall and carrying the slight stiffness of someone who hadn't been out of uniform long. On his shoulder hung a pack worn thin, the seams frayed, as if it had carried him through hundreds of miles. When he reached them, he stopped, his eyes going to Jamie sleeping inside his coat. He didn't ask anything, only tilted his head slightly, a look passing through his eyes, somewhere between relief and concern. Mira said nothing, unsure whether to give the coat back or keep it. Ethan decided for her. He sat down beside them, pulled a small thermos from his pack, and poured a bit of warm water, holding it out to her. She took it, her fingers trembling from the heat, drank a small sip, then passed it to her son. Jamie blinked up at her, took the cup, and drank in slow, careful swallows. There was no long conversation, only the chatter of sparrows on the power lines and the distant rumble of a truck. But in that quiet, Mira realized she no longer felt entirely cut off from the world. This man didn't ask about her past, didn't offer empty pity. He was simply there, quiet but solid, and his being there felt like a thin shield between her and whatever waited outside. When Jamie finished, Ethan stood, slinging the pack back over his shoulder. Before leaving, he set a small packet of crackers beside her, then walked on, his pace neither hurried nor slow enough for anyone to catch up. Mira watched until he disappeared around the bend, a strange feeling settling in her chest. Part wanted to know more, part wanted to keep this exact distance. That day, Mira chose to leave the post office awning and look for a spot better sheltered from the wind. She moved through narrow alleys, carrying Jamie, still wrapped in the coat. She didn't say it out loud, but she knew she was carrying a piece of that man's warmth. Not just the physical heat, but the sense that somewhere out there, someone might come back, even if only to set a small package beside her. That resolve, to protect her son, to hold on to these small pieces of good before anyone could take them, threaded through her like a red string, pulling her along the damp streets toward days she couldn't yet see. But at least this morning, her steps were not as heavy as they'd been the night before. By midday, the gray clouds had thinned, letting through rare patches of early spring blue. The sun was weak, but enough to dry the rain still clinging to the streets. Mira carried Jamie along the narrow path leading to the old market, where long-standing stalls crowded together under patched tin roofs, the smell of roasting coffee mixing with the scent of new fabric from the clothing booths. Jamie was tired, so Mira held him more than she let him walk. With every step, she adjusted the blanket around him so it wouldn't slip, switching arms to keep the numb ache from running down her muscles. To passers-by, they were just two faded figures blending into the busy backdrop. No one knew that behind Myra's watchful eyes was a string of sleepless nights, sudden fevers, and the constant fear that one small mistake could take away the only thing that mattered. That was when a slow, steady voice came from behind her. Mira turned and saw Ethan standing at the mouth of the alley, holding a brown paper bag. He didn't walk right up, just lifted the bag slightly, as if waiting for her to decide. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and took it, saying nothing, only giving a small nod. Inside were a few small cartons of milk and a packet of instant porridge, the kind she knew Jamie could keep down even when he wasn't well. Ethan didn't stay. He turned and walked in the opposite direction, his tall frame slipping into the crowd. Mira found herself holding the bag tighter than necessary. She thought about the coat from the night before, the packet of crackers that morning, and now this bag of milk and porridge. No questions, no noisy pity, just quiet actions, repeated like a steady breath. That afternoon, after Jamie had fallen asleep, Mira found a wooden step in front of a shuttered radio repair shop. Sunlight angled through the awning slats, laying a warm yellow stripe across her son's face. She sat there, gently smoothing his soft hair, feeling something unfamiliar stir in her chest. It was like a seed being watered for the first time after a long winter. She remembered those first days after being told to leave her in-laws' house, carrying her son from street to street, her only thought then being how to make it to the next day. Now, with the unexpected warmth from this soldier's quiet gestures, she started to picture something farther ahead, a steady place to stay, a roof under which Jamie could wake up smiling. The idea scared her because it felt like a fragile dream, but it also made her want to fight harder, to cling to every small chance the way a person clings to a scrap of wood in rough seas. Mira sat there for a long time, until the last of the sunlight left the street. In the whisper of wind under the awning and the sound of footsteps fading into the gray hum of town, she pulled her son closer, silently promising that if another chance came, no matter how small, she would not let it slip away. The next morning, the air was still heavy with mist, and the line of trees along the levee road on the north side of town swayed lightly in the damp breeze. Mira carried Jamie inside the thin coat, walking steadily along the dirt track that led out past the market. Somewhere ahead, the wooden wheels of a vegetable seller's cart clattered faintly, mixing with the scattered calls of sparrows searching for their breakfast. She hadn't planned to go far, just far enough to find a patch of warm sun where Jamie might stop shivering. Along the way, puddles left from last night's rain caught the pale sky and their surfaces, trembling whenever the wind passed over. Mira kept walking, her eyes flicking back now and then, an old habit rooted in those early months of drifting from place to place, when every street corner carried the risk of being told to move along. At the end of the levee road, a small clearing opened up, looking out over a rice field just beginning to green. The morning sun poured down, sliding across the blades of young shoots until they glimmered as if dusted with silver. Mira spread the warm blanket and set Jamie down so he could watch the field, then opened the paper bag from the day before. The milk carton and instant porridge were still there. She'd saved them for when they were truly needed. Today, she tore the packet open, poured in warm water from her tiny thermos, and let the gentle steam carry its light scent into the cool air. Jamie took the porridge in slow spoonfuls, his eyes half closed from lingering fatigue. Mira didn't rush him. After each swallow, she wiped the corner of his mouth with her hand, the motion steady, almost meditative, as if that small act kept her anchored in the present instead of slipping into the cold weight of old memories. A quiet sound came from the road. Mira looked up and saw Ethan approaching from a distance, carrying a weathered briefcase in one hand and a large coffee thermos in the other. He didn't come straight over. He stopped at the wooden fence, letting his gaze rest on the field as though that were the reason he'd found himself here. Only when their eyes met did he raise a hand in a small greeting, then step forward just enough to place the coffee thermos and another paper bag at the edge of the blanket. There was no explanation, no question, just the sound of his boots receding, folding back into the early wind. Mira opened the bag, a few small bread rolls and a red apple. Simple things, yet the steadiness of them over these last days had begun to form something unfamiliar. A sense that, in a world full of upheaval, there could still be a rhythm meant only for her and Jamie. She broke off a piece of bread for her son, her eyes following the tall frame of the soldier as it faded into the distance. For a moment, she realized the warmth she felt wasn't only from the morning sun or the hot porridge, but from something deeper, the quiet knowledge that someone was standing just far enough away not to intrude, but close enough not to abandon them. The breeze off the levee picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth and young rice. Mira pulled the blanket tighter around Jamie and took a long breath. The sun was higher now, and she knew she would keep moving, keep looking for a day when this open patch of ground wouldn't have to be their only shelter. But for the first time in months, she felt she wasn't walking through it all completely alone. That afternoon, the town seemed wrapped in a thick layer of golden light, spilling from the old tile rooftops down across every brick of the square. The wind had lost its morning bite, but it still carried the damp smell of fallen leaves and the soft rustle of the tall maples surrounding the center. Mira walked slowly, Jamie in her arms, his head resting on her shoulder. He'd managed a little bread and some milk, but each time the wind slipped past, his breathing caught in a faint rasp. The square was quiet, just a few elderly folks talking idly on the benches, and a small group of teenagers practicing their skateboards at the far end. Mira found an empty bench near the fountain, with a steady fall of water created a kind of peace she rarely found anymore. She set Jamie down, unwrapped the blanket from around him, and gently smoothed the mess of hair over his forehead. A while later, from the direction of the town hall, she noticed Ethan's figure. He didn't walk straight toward them, but angled across the square, keeping just enough distance. He chose a low stone ledge beneath a maple tree, sat down, and set his cap beside him. In his hands was a thin, worn notebook and a pencil. He bent over it, writing or sketching, now and then glancing toward the kids playing before lowering his head again to the page. Mira wasn't trying to watch him, but her eyes kept drifting back. There was something about the man, a quiet that wasn't cold, a presence that didn't press in, that left her both wary and strangely at ease. She knew soldiers often carried things they couldn't fully put into words, and Ethan was no exception. A sudden gust swept through, and Jamie shivered, clinging to her neck. Mira pulled the blanket up higher, leaned her lips to his hair, murmuring something she herself couldn't hear clearly. When she looked up again, Ethan had left the stone ledge and was at a nearby roasted nut stand. He bought a small paper bag, dropped a few coins into the vendor's palm, then returned, not directly to her, but to place the bag on the bench beside hers, just a few steps away. He didn't say a word, only gave a single nod before turning and walking back toward the main street. Mira glanced at the bag, then at his retreating frame disappearing behind the trees. And in that moment, it struck her, maybe joy didn't have to be loud or dazzling. Maybe it could live in small gestures, repeated just enough to remind you that you were still seen, still remembered. Jamie picked up a few nuts in his hand, sniffed them curiously. He gave a small laugh, thin as the afternoon sunlight glancing off the fountain's surface. Mira held that image in her heart like a warm stone tucked in her coat pocket, something she could reach for later, when night came and the wind threaded through old window frames, to remind herself she hadn't drifted completely away. The day leaned toward evening. The gold light began to pull back from the square, leaving long shadows across the bricks. Mira lifted Jamie into her arms again, wrapping the blanket snug around him, and started off in the opposite direction of the main street, down a quieter road that led to a corner where they could sit out the night. In her chest, a different rhythm began to beat, like a small drum announcing that tomorrow, no matter what, she would find a way to keep these moments of peace from being taken away. The sky was still heavy after the night's rain, the street damp and streaked with faint, misty patches like breath on glass. Ethan had been up early, a habit he'd never shaken from his years in the service. He stood by the window of his small house, coffee cooling in his hand, eyes on the long stretch of road where delivery trucks passed now and then, their hollow noise breaking the quiet of the town. From here, he could see the corner where Mira and Jamie usually walked by each morning. But today, they hadn't appeared. Something low and persistent stirred in him, enough to make him pull on his coat and step outside. His boots carried him past a few houses, past the old repair shop that had been closed for years, until he stopped at the corner where the morning light slid over weathered red brick walls. There, outside the all-night laundromat, Mira sat in a plastic chair, her arms wrapped around Jamie as if she could make herself the only barrier against the cold seeping through his clothes. The boy slept fitfully, his cheeks flushed from a light fever, each breath a faint, wheezing rattle like wind caught in a narrow pipe. Ethan didn't go straight over. He stayed far enough back not to startle her. Even in what looked like unguarded moments, she carried that watchfulness in her eyes. Her damp hair clung to her temples, her lips pale, but her hand never stopped moving over the boy's back, as if letting go for even a second would give the world a chance to take him. And in that moment, Ethan understood something with a clarity that surprised him. It wasn't shared joy that held the most power. It was the will to defend that joy that kept people rooted. A gust of wind rattled the laundromat's door, and Mira pulled Jamie tighter. The gesture, simple, wordless, was like a vow. It reminded Ethan of nights on the line, gripping his rifle through the cold, holding it not just for himself, but for the fragile faith of the men beside him that they'd still be alive to see daylight. And here, right in front of him, Mira was doing the same. He stepped forward, then stopped. Coming on too fast would make him part of what she had to guard against every day. Instead, he ducked into the small grocery next door and bought 2 hot coffees and a sandwich. When he came back, he set the paper bag and 1 coffee cup down at her feet without a word, just a short nod. She looked at him for a second, not quite trust, but not completely closed off anymore. He turned away, leaving the choice to her. At the end of the block, he glanced back and saw she'd opened the bag, wrapping the paper napkin around the coffee cup to warm Jamie's small hands. A small, ordinary thing, but to Ethan it carried more weight than any battle he'd fought, because here there were no orders, no weapons, only life and the cost of keeping it. By noon the clouds had broken, and sunlight spilled into the town. In his garage, Ethan was fixing the leg of an old wooden chair when he heard light footsteps. Looking up, he saw Mira standing there with Jamie in her arms. She didn't say thank you, just placed a neatly folded gray knit scarf on the workbench. Ethan looked at it and understood. In the truest connections, sometimes a small act could speak for 1,000 words. That afternoon, passing the town hospital, Ethan spotted Dr. Harlan Price on the steps. The doctor handed him a small bag of fever medicine. "She'll need this," was all he said, with no explanation needed. Ethan took it, knowing that in this town, there were still people willing to stand beside those fighting quietly. By evening, the wind had shifted, carrying a chill in from the lake. Ethan sat alone on his porch, the medicine beside him. He knew he'd find a way to get it to Mira in the morning, but not as a favor, rather as part of a promise he'd made to himself. If her and Jamie's joy had a chance to survive, he'd do whatever it took to guard it. And somewhere in the quiet air of the town, a new resolve settled in, leaving no room for hesitation. The morning lay under a thin veil of mist, soft and colorless, quieting the streets more than usual. Ethan sat in the kitchen, his hand wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, eyes resting on the bag of fever medicine he'd left on the table the night before. He stared at it for a long while, as though weighing whether to bring it to Mira right now or wait for a moment that felt right. He knew that for a child like Jamie, every hour could make a difference, but for a mother used to contempt and always on guard, any help given too quickly could feel like another burden. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside. The early air was cold and damp, smelling faintly of wet grass with each breath. He cut through the small market. At this hour, only a few vegetable stalls had opened, then headed toward the laundromat. The spot where Mira had sat yesterday was empty now, only a damp mark on the concrete showing someone had been there not long ago. He took the back alleys, where sunlight was blocked by low roofs, until he found her in the open lot behind the town library. She was spreading their warm blanket on the ground, setting Jamie down so the boy could take in a bit of fresh air. Jamie's face was pale, his eyes dull, but when he saw Ethan, he managed a faint smile before coughing softly. Myra's hand went straight to his chest, as if to shield him from the cough pushing deeper. Ethan said nothing, just held out the bag of medicine. Mira looked at it, then at him, her eyes measuring between need and a pride that had been bruised too many times. After a moment's silence, she took it. Her fingers brushed his, cold and dry, but enough for Ethan to feel a fragile kind of acceptance. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice almost carried off by the wind. He nodded, making no move to fill the air with words. For someone like Mira, silence was often the ground where trust could take root. They sat for a few minutes, watching Jamie rest with his eyes closed. Up close, Ethan could see how thin the boy's skin was, the faint blue veins showing through, like something that might break if not carefully guarded. He wondered how the two of them had made it through so many nights on the street and still held on to each other. Without warning, Mira pulled the blanket tighter around Jamie and stood. "I need to get him to the hospital for a checkup," she said. Ethan only nodded before she lifted the boy and headed off, her small frame disappearing into the pale silver fog. He stayed watching until they were gone, his chest heavy with that old battlefield feeling of knowing you couldn't protect everything worth protecting. That afternoon, he went to the hospital to check in. The halls were bright and cold, the smell of disinfectant clinging to the air. Dr. Harlan Price stepped out of the pediatric ward, pausing when he saw Ethan. "The boy needs plenty of rest and less worry," the doctor said quietly, the last words meant for more than just Jamie. Ethan passed the waiting area and saw Mira there, Jamie asleep against her shoulder. Her hair was a little untidy, her eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep, but her hands stayed clasped around her son's. As Ethan turned to leave, Mira looked up, and for the first time, her gaze held more than guardedness. There was something like an unspoken question in it, as if she were weighing whether she could lean on him just a little more. He gave a small nod and walked on, leaving enough space for that question to stay unanswered, at least for now. Inside him, a truth was beginning to settle. Some battles aren't won by force or strategy, but only by showing up, day after day, moment after moment, without rushing the ground you're trying to hold. By the time he stepped outside, the day was leaning toward evening. The last light caught in the hospital windows and spilled in broken patches across the sidewalk. Ethan slowed his pace, thinking about tomorrow, and how he could find a way to be there, not too much, not too little, right when she and the boy might need him. That morning, the sky was unusually clear, as if the rain from the night before had rinsed the last haze off the town. Sunlight angled softly through the kitchen window of Ethan's house, laying long stripes across the scratched wooden table. He sat there, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee he didn't drink. The words and numbers from Clara's file still circled in his head, blending with the image of Mira leaning over to shield Jamie from the wind. He wondered if his own silence all this time wasn't too different from the way the whole town had stayed silent about the two of them. And then it struck him, some silences are harmless, but some are complicit. The thought made him stand, pull on his coat, and step out into the street. When Ethan reached the familiar alley, Mira was sweeping leaves in front of the house. Her hair was tied back, though a few strands had slipped loose against her cheek. Jamie sat on the porch step, holding a thin blanket, his eyes following the swirl of leaves in the breeze. Ethan stopped a few steps away. "Need a hand?" His voice was low, just enough to carry. Mira looked up, her hands pausing on the broom handle. There was a brief flicker in her expression before she gave a small shake of her head. "I'm used to it. Thank you." He didn't leave. His gaze drifted toward the weathered fence, and after a moment he said, "This place, the back roof looks like it's leaking. Saw water running down the wall the other day." Mira was quiet, her eyes shifting for just a second. She knew he was right. "I'll figure it out," she said, her voice small. A stretch of silence fell between them, filled only by the broom's rasp on the concrete. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket, pulled out an old business card, and set it on the porch step beside Jamie. "If you need anything, call me. I'm not always free, but I'll try." Jamie stared at the card like it was some odd trinket. Mira bent to pick it up, her fingers brushing the worn edge of the paper, but she said nothing. That afternoon, Ethan stopped by the hospital to see Dr. Harlan Price. The man's office sat in a quiet wing, the smell of antiseptic mingling with the dry scent of paper files. Harlan looked up from a patient chart, his face steady. "Been a while since I've seen you," he said evenly. Ethan took the chair across from him. "I want to ask about a boy. Jamie Dawson." Harlan's brow furrowed, not in surprise, but as if weighing what to say. "The boy's fragile. Weak lungs. Prone to pneumonia. His mother brings him in when it's bad, usually too late." He paused, then added, "Not because she's careless, because circumstances." Ethan didn't answer, but the weight in his eyes said enough. Harlan closed the file, resting his forearms on the desk. "What are you planning to do?" His voice had dropped, almost like a warning. "I don't know yet, but if it keeps going like this, I'm afraid one day it'll be too late to do anything." On the walk home, the town seemed to show itself in a different light. The wooden houses, white fences, cobblestone streets. Everything looked peaceful, yet he knew there were corners people chose not to see. That night, he wrote a few lines on a scrap of paper, not to send, but to remind himself. Helping doesn't always mean grand gestures. Sometimes it's just staying close enough so someone knows they're not left behind. He folded the paper and tucked it into the coat hanging by the door. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the damp scent of earth after rain. He knew what lay ahead wouldn't be easy, especially now that Walter Dawson's name was surfacing more often in the coffee shop chatter, outside the post office, even in the hospital corridors. But he also knew this. If he didn't start now, there might never be a chance to change anything. He turned off the light, leaving the room in soft darkness. In his mind, Mira and Jamie appeared again. This time, not blurred by distance, but clear enough that it felt like they were sitting just across the table, waiting for him to speak. That morning, the town still carried the damp aftertaste of a night's rain, but sunlight was already breaking through, laying soft streaks of light across the cobblestone street. Ethan woke earlier than usual. He opened the kitchen window, letting in the smell of wet wood and the far-off sound of a rooster's call. On the table, the note he'd written the night before lay where he'd left it, neatly folded. He slipped it into his coat pocket, a quiet reminder to himself. Passing the corner grocery, he noticed the shopkeeper, a middle-aged man who rarely looked up from his work, pause in stacking boxes to glance at him. It wasn't quite curiosity, more like calculation. Since his talk with Harlan, Ethan had noticed more looks like that. Maybe word had gotten around that he'd been visiting the small house at the end of the alley. By midday, Clara found him at the old cafe where they'd met countless times when they were younger. The place hadn't changed, the same dark wood tables, the same chalkboard menu behind the counter. She set a thin file on the table without a word, waiting until the waiter had gone before leaning in, her voice low. "Walter Dawson. He's had almost total control over Myra's finances since her husband died. But there's something strange in the paperwork." Ethan waited. Clara pulled a single sheet from the file and tapped a line of small print at the bottom. "If Mira remarries, or leaves town for more than 3 months, custody of Jamie automatically transfers to Walter. And he doesn't have to prove his fitness as a guardian." Ethan's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. It was like fog tearing open to reveal something darker underneath. Clara's gaze was steady, tinged with worry. "I think that's why she stays. She'll never leave her boy, and she won't take on Walter head-on, because she'd lose before it even started." He didn't answer, but in his mind he saw Mira sweeping leaves, thin arms steady, and Jamie wrapped in a blanket, watching the leaves fall. They were living inside an invisible fence, every step measured so as not to cross its line. That afternoon, Ethan walked down the narrow alley to Myra's house. He didn't knock, just stood for a moment in the small yard beyond the fence. Mira was hanging laundry, tiny shirts, and faded clothes fluttering in the breeze. Jamie sat beneath a tree, lining up small stones in a careful row. Ethan crouched down beside him. "What are you building?" he asked gently. Jamie looked up, eyes bright but cautious. "A train," he murmured, then went back to arranging the stones. Mira turned, surprised to see him there. "Something wrong?" Her voice still carried that edge of guardedness. Ethan shook his head. "Just wanted to see how you two were doing." She said nothing, only adjusted the clothesline higher so the shirts wouldn't brush the ground. But her eyes passed over him briefly, and Ethan caught a faint shift there. Not trust yet, but no longer a locked gate. On the walk back, Clara's words replayed in his head. He knew he couldn't move too fast. Walter Dawson wasn't the sort of man who let anyone block his path without making them pay for it. But he also knew that if nothing changed, everything would stay exactly as it was. Mira's still under his control, Jamie's still fragile, and both bound by cold, impersonal lines of ink on a contract. That night, Ethan took the folded note from his pocket, opened it, and wrote one more line beneath what was already there. Sometimes helping isn't just standing close. It's being ready to take a step, even knowing the ground ahead is all stone. He slid it into his desk drawer, a plan without a name, but already taking shape. Outside, the wind was up again. Streetlight filtered through the window, shadows of swaying branches moving across the wall. Ethan sat there, listening to the low, uncertain hum of the town at night, and told himself it was time to find a way to break this cycle of silence. Not with noise, but with steady steps, one after another, until Mira and Jamie could walk into the light without fear. Morning settled over the town in a thin wash of fog, the kind that draped itself over rooftops and curled around the roadside trees. Ethan was up early, not because he hadn't slept enough, but because his mind was still turning over Clara's word from the day before. He poured a mug of black coffee, stood at the window, and looked out at the empty street. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle cut through the wind, a sound that felt both familiar and strange, like an echo from years spent in other places, where mornings always came laced with waiting and watchfulness. He decided not to stop by the cafe or the paper today. Instead, he walked toward the far end of town, down the road that led to Myra's house. He didn't have a plan, not exactly, but felt the need to see more, understand more, not just about Mira and Jamie, but about the quiet cage holding them in place. When he arrived, he paused just outside the fence. Mira was kneeling by a patch of dirt, pulling weeds from around small green vegetable plants. She was so focused she didn't see him right away. Jamie sat a few feet away, clutching a worn teddy bear, glancing at his mother every so often before going back to fussing with a toy train missing a wheel. Ethan didn't step in, just watched for a moment. It felt like a still life, painting, each small movement carrying a kind of fragility. When Mira finally looked up, there was surprise in her eyes, but not the guarded wall he'd seen before. "You're here again?" she asked, her voice low but softer than last time. He nodded. "Just passing by. The vegetables look good." She smiled faintly, not a relaxed smile, but enough to close the distance a little. "Planting for Jamie. He's sick a lot. Doctor says fresh food will help." Ethan studied the neat rows, realizing how much work they must have taken. He crouched down near Jamie. "What happened to the train from last time?" Jamie held up the battered toy. "Wheels broken, but it still runs." Something about that answer caught in Ethan's chest. It was the way these two were living, damaged but still moving forward. He sat with the boy, working to adjust the axle. Mira kept weeding, though her eyes landed on them now and then. He could tell she didn't fully trust him yet, but his presence no longer felt like a threat. On his way out, Ethan took the narrow lane behind the house. That's when he noticed a black car parked tight against the curb, windows tinted, engine idling. No one got out. That old military instinct prickled along his neck, the sense of being watched. He didn't stop, just glanced at it as he passed. The car stayed where it was. That evening, he told Clara about it when she stopped by. She was quiet for a moment before saying, "Could be Walter's people. You want to know who Myra's talking to." Ethan rested his arm along the back of the chair, eyes on the dark window. "If that's true, then he's already seen me." Clara nodded, her gaze steady. Be careful. Walter doesn't make a move unless he's sure he'll win. But, you know as well as I do, sometimes the only way to break a position is to force the other side into the open. Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought about Myra's voice when she'd mentioned planting vegetables for Jamie. The quiet determination of someone living under pressure but holding fast to something small and good. Whatever he did next, it couldn't shatter that fragile peace. That night, the town was so still he could hear the wind brushing against the windows. He sat at his desk, jotting down scattered notes. Not a finished plan, just loose points. Things to look into, the name of an old lawyer he knew from his service days, the need to gather proof without drawing too much attention. When he folded the paper, he told himself, don't rush. But don't stop. Somewhere out there, Walter Dawson was likely mapping his own moves. Between the two of them, the quiet match had begun, even if Mira and Jamie didn't yet know they were on the board. Ethan blew out the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. Outside, the wind kept on, a reminder that this was only a pause before the storm truly broke. That morning, a fine mist hung over the town, a thin film of rain drifting down like powdered glass. Ethan left his small house earlier than usual, pulling on the worn coat whose color had faded to something between gray and brown. The streets were damp, patched with puddles from the night before. The air was cool and carried the mixed scent of earth and wet timber from the shopfront awnings. He decided to cut through the small market before heading to Myra's. The tin-roof stalls stood shoulder to shoulder, steam rising from crates of freshly watered vegetables. He bought a bag of carrots and a few apples, something Jamie could eat without trouble. The old vendor who handed them over gave him a short nod, no questions asked. In a town like this, silence was often the purest form of respect. When he reached Myra's house, the door was closed but not latched. He knocked lightly and waited. She appeared in the frame, hair still damp, eyes holding a trace of surprise. "You're early," she said, her voice carrying a note of weariness. "Brought something for Jamie." Ethan lifted the bag of carrots and apples. She opened the door wider, gesturing him inside. Jamie was sitting on a threadbare rug, arranging wooden blocks in uneven towers. He looked up, offered a small smile, and returned to his game. Mira set the bag on the kitchen table. "Thank you," she said quietly, toweling her hair. Ethan nodded, but didn't add anything. While she moved around the kitchen, his gaze caught on a few crumpled sheets in the wastebasket. A corner of one page showed neat, clipped handwriting. He hadn't meant to read, but he caught a few words: custody, petition, hearing date. A thread of tension worked its way up his spine. Stepping out to the back porch, he looked past the fence to the narrow road leading west. The black sedan was gone, but the sense of being watched lingered like a shadow. Clara's words came back. Walter never makes a move unless he knows he'll win. If those papers were from the court, the clock was already ticking. Mira joined him on the porch, her eyes on the small garden. "How do the vegetables look?" she asked softly. "They're coming along. But with rain like this, watch for rot," he replied. A long pause passed between them. Then Mira spoke, almost to herself. "Walter wants to take Jamie. Says I can't take care of him." Ethan turned, but she didn't meet his eyes. Her lips pressed together, as if stating a fact she'd already made peace with, at least on the surface. He wanted to ask more, but instead he said, "You're not alone in this." She exhaled slowly, then went back inside. Ethan stayed, listening to the rain ticking on the corrugated roof, weighing the shape of what lay ahead. Later that day, he found Clara in her office, the air heavy with the smell of paper and ink. When he told her about the papers in Myra's trash, her face sharpened. "If they're court filings, then he's already made his move," she said evenly. "We'll need proof, clear proof, that Myra's a good mother, and that Jamie belongs with her." Ethan nodded, feeling the old clarity of mission settle in. But this wasn't the kind of fight he'd trained for. There would be no terrain maps or direct orders, just an invisible battleground where every detail mattered. That night, back at his desk, he pulled out a small notebook and began a list. Not a battle plan, but the groundwork. Talk to Dr. Harlan Price about Jamie's health. Find witnesses who could speak to Myra's care. Check her old employment records. He knew Walter had money, influence, and no hesitation to use both. But there are fights you don't back away from. Not when the stakes are a child and the mother who loves him. Outside, the rain tapped on the roof, steady and patient. Under its rhythm, Ethan could almost hear his own steps carrying him down a long road. One where every stride came with the weight of duty and the echo of years gone by. This time, there was no turning away. That morning was clearer than the days before, but the cold still clung to the wind. Ethan left the house while a thin veil of mist still blurred the street. Hands buried in his coat pockets, he walked past quiet wooden porches, his mind running through the list he'd made the night before. First stop, Dr. Harlan Price. The town hospital sat at the end of Main Street, a two-story white building with rows of half-shut windows. Inside, the air carried the mix of disinfectant, paper, and the soft squeak of rubber soles on tile. Ethan went straight to the reception desk. He didn't need to explain much. Everyone here knew him, and they knew Dr. Price rarely turned anyone away if the matter was genuine. When Ethan knocked lightly on the frame of the exam room door, Dr. Price was bent over a file, writing. The older man looked up, his calm eyes narrowing slightly, as though already piecing together why Ethan had come. Sit, he said, voice rough but warm. Ethan sat, fingers laced together. I need to ask about Jamie Dawson, he began. His health, and whether his medical records could help prove Myra's a good mother. Dr. Price was quiet for a few beats, then gave a small nod. Jamie was born premature, weak lungs, prone to fevers and infections. But Myra, she's careful, patient, follows every instruction. His progress is because of her. He paused, studying Ethan's face. But medical records are private. I can only release them with Myra's consent. Ethan understood. That conversation would have to come later. Still, hearing Dr. Price confirm Myra's care gave him a solid place to start. Instead of going home, Ethan stopped by the newsroom. Clara was at her desk in a wash of afternoon light, coffee at her elbow, papers spread out in front of her. When he told her about his meeting with Harlan, she lifted an eyebrow. That's good, she said. If Myra agrees, I can help copy and file them with her response. She went to a cabinet, pulled out a slim folder, and slid it across the desk. And this, something I dug up. Walter's done this before. Took custody of 2 grandkids from their widowed mother. She didn't have a strong lawyer. Lost them in a single hearing. Ethan flipped through the pages, a cold weight settling in his chest. The language, the timing, it was all mapped out like a campaign. He couldn't let it happen again. That afternoon, he carried the file to Myra's. She opened the door, a flicker of caution in her eyes when she saw the papers in his hand. He told her about the newsroom, then said, Myra, Dr. Price will testify, but only with your consent. She sat down slowly. Jamie was napping in the other room, his breathing soft and even. Afternoon light from the window brushed her face in pale gold. I know Walter will try everything, she said quietly, but I didn't think he'd do it like that. He already has, Ethan said, passing her Clara's file. Here's proof. She read it page by page, her lips pressed tight. At the end, she let out a breath, eyes shining faintly. All right, I agree. If it keeps Jamie with me, I'll do it. Ethan nodded. It eased some of the weight on his shoulders, but he knew this was only the first step. That night, in his small kitchen, the signed consent form lay beside him on the table. Outside, wind moved across the roof, ringing the little chime that hung from the porch. He thought of his military days, missions with clear lines, enemies with defined faces. Here, the man he'd faced was a grandfather, wearing power and money like armor. Ethan knew there would come a day when he'd stand in court, look Walter Dawson straight in the eye, and not blink. But for now, his thoughts stayed with Jamie, the boy whose small hands always reached for the warmth of his mother. And he promised himself, whatever it took, that boy would not lose that warmth. The morning after the article and the tape went out, the town woke slower than usual. Last night's scattered rain still clung to shop signs, catching the light like ground glass. Out on the porch of his cabin, Ethan set his coffee mug on the wood step and listened to the forest shift. No more mocking knocks on the door. No strange cars idling out front. Just wind through the pines and the steady pour of the kettle in the kitchen. A sound both familiar and new, like someone had finally cut a cord that had been cinched around his chest. Clara sent a short text. Front page. No fanfare. No rallying cry. Just a simple headline and a black and white photo. Myra bent over, holding Jamie outside the clinic door, Ethan standing a little behind, one hand on the frame. The space between them said it all. No performance here, just a long, rough road they were trying to walk together. By noon, there was a paper bag tied with twine sitting on the old wooden mailbox. No name. Inside, a warm loaf of bread, a few apples, a bottle of children's cough syrup, and a quick note in pencil to help the boy sleep easier. Myra read it slowly, and the tight lines in her forehead eased, like someone had cracked a window in a stuffy room. She set the syrup on the shelf, dusted it off, and went to pour warm water. Jamie sat on the little rug, clutching the toy car he'd found the other day, eyes fixed on the door. When he spotted the green apple, he grinned, a small smile like a thin ray of sun landing on the floor. Clara's peace spread like heat from a coal stove. At the corner diner, the TV stayed on, but the voices were softer, the words less sharp. In the letters section, someone wrote, "I once stood all night in an ER holding my kid. Nobody asked. Seeing them, I remembered how I made it through. No name, no address." The story cracked open a drawer most grown-ups keep shut. Old fear, dry as pine wood, but when touched, it smelled clean again, no longer a threat. Ethan spent the afternoon checking the fence, fixing the gate hinges, tightening a loose screw in Jamie's window frame. Slow work, maybe a little too careful, but that kind of care kept his mind from running ahead of itself. He stopped when he heard Jamie's cough had gone from raw to soft, then in a steady breathing, like wind slipping through trees. In the service, Ethan had learned to trust small signs, the smell of dirt before a sandstorm, a flickering light that meant a short, the rhythm of boots after dark. Here, the signs told him that peace came from a string of small choices, repeated every day, starting with closing a door gently so a kid didn't wake up. Toward evening, Dr. Harlan Price showed up without warning, carrying a thin envelope. Inside was a short medical note. The fever had eased. The boy was responding well to medicine. No signs the mother was using substances or showing erratic behavior. Small, neat signature. No flourish. He left it on the table with a quiet nod. The kind of nod that said just enough, solid enough to hold back the thin cloud of rumor. In town, the changes weren't loud. The clinic receptionist stepped outside when Mira brought Jamie in for a follow-up, stuck a cartoon stamp on the back of his hand, smiled, then slipped away. The mechanic at the gas station topped off Ethan's washer fluid without charging. Little gestures, linked together, made a net that kept folks from getting pulled under by gossip. Walter walked past the bar on Main, dark coat, heavy cologne. The man who once seemed untouchable slow to beat when he saw the paper on the counter. Black and white photo. 3 faces, none of them looking at the camera. He touched the edge of the page, pulled his hand back, and set it down. Nobody said his name, but the clink of glasses seemed to sound different. His step fell just off the tile lines, like someone realizing the ground under him wasn't entirely his anymore. Clara didn't run another hard piece. She posted a small box in the middle pages. This week's food, diaper, and cough medicine drop-off spots. The newsroom number underneath, no bylines. Messages came in. Some wanted to donate quietly. Some said they'd once gotten a loaf of bread when they had nothing. Clara reformatted the list, made it easy to read, then shut off her office light late. She knew real help doesn't make a lot of noise. It builds momentum. And momentum is what gets people through a winter. In the kitchen, Mira simmered chicken porridge from the recipe she'd memorized in long nights with Jamie. Steam fogged the little window. She set out 3 bowls, 1 big, 2 small, and stood looking at them a while, like she wanted to memorize the picture in case it disappeared tomorrow. But the way Ethan pulled his chair in quietly, the way Jamie gripped the wooden spoon in both hands, made the scene feel less like wet paper and more like something with weight. Something built from repeated acts. Dinner, dishes, folding blankets, a short story before bed. The quiet rituals of a home. Later, a long-haul truck swept down the highway, throwing a thin band of light across the ceiling. Ethan sat on the porch steps, fingers laced, listening to the insects pick up their rhythm. The phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I'm the wife of an old buddy of yours. We read the story. If the boy ever needs an extra bed for a few nights, say the word." Ethan stared at the screen longer than he had to, then shut it off. He didn't want to add the debt of someone else's kindness to Myra's load. Kindness is its own kind of debt, and he wanted to repay it the right way, through steady presence. Close to midnight, a car rolled slow past the gate, paused, then moved on. In the morning, they found a basket of milk and cookies hanging from a post. No note. Mira wrapped it in cloth and set it in the kitchen corner. No rush, no fuss, no quick thank yous. Calm, careful, like someone relearning trust after a shipwreck. Claire called at lunch. Her voice was even, "There's a meeting coming up at the courthouse. Just procedure. No scare, no sugarcoating." Ethan hung up and looked at Mira. She nodded. They didn't dig into it. Words would only chip the quiet they'd managed to gather. They let simple motions speak. Check the papers, clip them straight, slip them into a folder, set it on the high shelf out of Jamie's reach. By late afternoon, with sunlight filtering through the pines, Jamie came running with a crayon drawing, 3 people side by side, a big yellow circle above them. Mira touched the worn pencil, smiling. Ethan reached over and pinned it to the wall next to the calendar. Nobody said family. The word was too big, too breakable. They just breathed the same rhythm and let the picture carry the rest. That night, a strong wind rattled the windows. Ethan was on his feet before he thought, sliding the latch. He paused, listening. No strange sounds, just Jamie rolling over, pulling the blanket to his chest. Ethan drew the curtain back and looked at a sky scattered with stars, still there whether anyone noticed or not. In the new quiet, he understood. Joy doesn't have to explode like fireworks. It could be an ember you cup in your hands, feeding it, sitting with it long enough for it to keep you warm. The next morning, Clara sent a link, short community comments. Some wanted to hold a small fundraiser in the churchyard. Some offered diapers. Some asked how to get food vouchers to them. Simple questions, no prying, no grandstanding. Mira read each one, her eyes steady now. She set the phone down, pulled a light jacket from the closet, and took Jamie out to the porch. The air was cold, but not cutting. The smell of pine mixed with yesterday's bread into something easy and calm. She knew empathy wouldn't erase the hurt, but it could change the fall from a straight drop into a slow arc, giving you time to grab the edge. Ethan locked the gate and turned away from the dirt road into the trees. He could feel the battle line had shifted from scraping by alone to having the nerve to accept a hand. Ahead lay the court date, the questions, the eyes that might not be kind. But behind them now, there were voices, quiet ones, but enough to know that if they fell, someone would reach out. On the table, Dr. Price's envelope lay next to the folded paper. Evidence of a rare sunny day in a cold season. Mira tucked them into a drawer and shut it with a soft, solid click. She bent to tie Jamie's shoes. He reached up to be carried, wrapped his arms around her neck like he'd done 100 times. That small weight on her shoulder, steady and warm, was reason enough. In that moment, Mira knew they'd keep going. Not out of anger that needed settling, but because this small joy was worth guarding any way they could. And it was that guarded joy, step by step, that was spreading like a thin ribbon of light on the road after rain, leading them toward the courthouse with a slow, steady faith. That morning, the sky hung low and gray, like a tarp stretched tight overhead, pressing down on the whole town with a kind of weight you couldn't quite name. Ethan stepped out onto the porch and took in the damp air of early fog. He knew it wasn't going to be a quiet day. In the pocket of his coat, he kept a small notebook, something that had become the map for every move he had left to make. When he reached the little coffee shop on the corner, Clara was already at a table by the window, a neat stack of papers and a tape recorder laid out in front of her. The thin light from outside slipped through the glass, laying long streaks across the dark wood of the table. "I got a lead last night," Clara said right away, lowering her voice. "A clerk at the town council office told me Walter sent a letter to every member, along with a packet of documents on Mira." Ethan sat, fingers lacing together. "What kind of documents?" "Unpaid bills, old doctor's notes from years back, even a few statements from former neighbors." She paused, locking eyes with him. "Some of it might be real, but most of it's been cut up or yanked out of context." Ethan didn't answer. A cold line ran down his back. Walter was smart enough not to forge anything outright. He'd just bend the truth until it broke in the right places. "We have to hit back with a stronger story," Clara said. "One that's all truth, stitched together so there's no seam to pull apart." Ethan nodded. From his coat, he pulled out a few pages Mira had given him. Notes on every time Jamie had gotten sick, receipts for medicine, a diagnosis from Dr. Harlan Price. Each sheet carried a blue or red stamp from years past. The kind of marks you couldn't fake, proof that Mira had never walked away from her boy. That afternoon, Ethan drove to the hospital. Dr. Harlan was in the on-call room, the door cracked open, the faint smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. "I need copies of all Jamie's medical records," Ethan said, slow but firm. "Every visit from the last 2 years." Dr. Price looked up, his face as steady as ever. "You know, Walter won't be happy about that." "I'm not here to make him happy," Ethan said. "I'm here to protect a child." The doctor was quiet for a beat, then nodded. He turned to his computer, typed in a password, and began printing page after page. The printer hummed along, blending with the first scattered drops of rain hitting the tin roof. When he handed the stack over, he said only, "Keep them safe. Some truths are only seen once before someone makes them disappear." By the time Ethan left, the rain had thickened. He stopped by Myra's small house. She was on the floor folding Jamie's clothes while the boy slept in a chair, cheeks flushed from the room's warmth. When Ethan held out the records, Myra's hand brushed the edge of the papers, her eyes a mix of gratitude and worry. "You think this will be enough to stop him?" Ethan looked at the boy, then back at her. "I don't know, but it's the one thing that can't be twisted, time, and what it leaves behind." That night, Ethan and Clara sat at his kitchen table, spreading the papers out like a battle map. Clara marked the timeline, noting what could be matched with public records. The warm yellow light over the table caught the creases in the pages. "We'll need witnesses," Clara said. "Ones Walter can't buy." Ethan thought of a few names, but he knew asking them wouldn't be easy. In a town like this, saying no to Walter was like locking every door in your own house. Still, he believed sometimes it only took one person standing up for others to find their own courage. When Clara left, the rain kept falling, the streetlights painting long streaks across the wet pavement. Ethan stayed at the table, running his hand over the first page of Jamie's file. He pictured the day of the hearing, those papers laid out in front of everyone, and a silence settling over the room before a single word was spoken. The fight was only beginning, but in the rain's steady rhythm, he thought he heard something close to belief, fragile, but just enough to keep him moving. The next morning, the light was thin and almost colorless, seeping through a bank of heavy clouds that still held the chill and damp from last night's rain. Ethan rose early, poured himself a mug of strong black coffee, and sat at the table, staring at the spread of papers from the night before. They weren't just documents. They were fragments of a story Walter was trying to twist, and Ethan needed to piece them together before someone tore them apart for good. Clara showed up around 7, hair still touched with mist, a thick envelope in her hand. "I've copied everything," she said, setting it on the table. "But Ethan, I just heard Walter's planning a closed-door meeting with a few people at the courthouse this weekend." Ethan's eyes darkened. He didn't ask how she knew. Around here, information had a way of finding those willing to listen. "If he's moving first, then we make sure he has to face the truth now," he said, his voice low, steady. After Clara left to prepare her article, Ethan shrugged into his coat and drove to the hospital. Dr. Harlan Price was in pediatrics. Jamie sat in the waiting chair, his eyes heavy from exhaustion but still scanning the room. Mira sat beside him, her hand wrapped tightly around his. "He's been running a high fever all night," Mira said softly when she saw Ethan. "I gave him medicine, but it barely helped." Dr. Price motioned him inside. He checked Jamie's temperature, listened to his chest, wrote a few notes. "Respiratory infection," he said at last. "Not dangerous if treated properly, but he needs rest and close watch." Ethan nodded. He knew every time Jamie got sick, Mira burned through more of her strength. And Walter would use it as proof she couldn't care for her own son. When Mira took Jamie home, Ethan stayed behind with the doctor. "Would you be willing to testify if it comes to that?" Ethan asked. Dr. Price held his gaze for a long moment, weighing more than just the question. "I don't take sides, Ethan, but I'll stand on the side of a child who needs protecting. If it goes to court, I'll speak to what I know." It was the kind of answer that eased something in Ethan, though he knew the road ahead was long. That afternoon, he went to Myra's house. The air was warm with the smell of chicken soup on the stove, though her eyes still carried worry. "You think he'll stop if he sees we've got evidence?" she asked. "No," Ethan said plainly, "but he'll know we're not staying quiet, and that's what he hates most." Together, they sorted the files into groups: medical records, prescription receipts, Myra's handwritten notes on Jamie's care. Each paper went into a plastic sleeve, clearly labeled. Ethan knew everything had to be airtight. One crack, and Walter would pry it open. By dusk, Clara texted, "I just spoke with someone who used to work for Walter. He'll meet, but only somewhere private. You coming?" Ethan replied, "Tell me when and where." An hour later, he and Clara sat in the cold back room of an abandoned diner. The man across from them looked worn down, like someone who'd been carrying a secret too long. "I used to deliver envelopes to folks at the courthouse," he said quietly. "Never opened them, but everyone knew what was inside. Walter paid cash. No trail." Clara's recorder clicked on. "Would you be willing to say that in court?" she asked, her voice steady but soft. He stared at the table for a long time. Finally, "If I have to, I will. But you make sure my family's safe." When they stepped outside, the street was empty, the night air smelling of old rain. Ethan felt the pressure tightening, each step toward the truth drawing him closer to danger. But stepping back now meant leaving Mira and Jamie to Walter, something he could never allow. On the way home, he slowed as he passed Myra's. The living room light was still on. Through the thin curtain, her shadow bent over the chair where Jamie slept. In that quiet glimpse, Ethan understood the fight wasn't just about stopping Walter. It was about keeping that room lit, so the sound of that boy's breathing would never have to leave this house. That morning, a heavy gray sky hung over the town, the light just enough to show the still rooftops and near-empty streets. Ethan had woken early, standing by the window of his rented room, looking down at the small parking lot where a few puddles reflected that weight in the clouds. He'd seen enough mornings in the service to know the gloom didn't just come from the weather. It was the weight in your chest when you knew the day ahead wouldn't be an easy one. Clara had texted him the night before. Tomorrow, Walter's meeting with a few folks from the town council. I need you nearby, not to start trouble, just so we know what he's saying. Ethan hadn't answered right away, but he knew. Every move Walter made had to be watched. Before heading out, he stopped by Myra's place. The small house still carried the smell of cold medicine and thin rice porridge, signs she'd been up for hours tending to Jamie. The boy was asleep on the couch, hair messy, cheeks still flushed from the fever, but breathing steady now. Myra opened the door, her eyes tired yet still edged with caution when she saw Ethan. I won't stay long, he said quietly. Just wanted to make sure you two are okay. She nodded, leaning against the doorway. His fever's down, but I don't like being alone when he's in town. Ethan didn't have to ask who she meant. He rested a hand on the wooden doorframe, like a silent promise. I'll be back soon. Late that morning, Ethan stood on the corner across from the old brick town hall. Red walls, high roof, a set of heavy double doors up a flight of stone steps. He didn't go in, just watched. Walter showed up right on time, dark suit, slow, confident stride, like everything in this town was already in his pocket. A few other men shook his hand before they all went inside. Clara arrived moments later, knit cap pulled down, heavy coat zipped, a small camera in her hand. She didn't start shooting, just stood beside Ethan, eyes fixed on the doors. I've got someone inside, she said, but he can't text. We just have to wait till Walter comes out. A cold wind ran down the street, carrying the smell of coffee from across the way. Ethan pulled his collar up, gaze locked on the building. He'd spent hours waiting in war zones, but this was different, waiting with no control over what was happening behind those walls. Over an hour later, Walter stepped out, giving a thin smile to someone, shaking hands again before heading down the steps. As soon as he was gone, a town hall worker slipped Clara a folded note. She opened it, read quickly, and stuffed it into her pocket. He's pushing a new child protection proposal, she said, her voice low but sharp. Sounds noble, but it's just a legal wedge to go after Myra's custody. Ethan stayed quiet. Walter never attacked in the open. He wrapped himself in good intentions, so anyone standing in his way looked like they were against doing the right thing. They split at the corner. Ethan drove toward the edge of town, but didn't head home. He pulled into an abandoned gas station. Nothing left but rusted pumps and a sagging canopy. He needed the quiet to think. The pieces were lining up now. The man with the envelope, Jamie's medical file, and this protection plan. All of it pointed to one goal, taking Jamie from Myra for good. By late afternoon, Ethan was back at Myra's. Jamie was awake, sitting at a little table working a puzzle. He looked up and gave a weak smile when he saw Ethan. Myra was peeling an apple, the knife moving slow at her hand. Find anything? She asked. Ethan told her everything. Myra went still, lips pressed tight. It was a while before she spoke. I knew he hated me, but I didn't think he'd go this far. Ethan met her eyes, his voice steady. We're not going to let him. But, Myra, we have to be ready for the worst. She nodded, no more questions. And in her eyes, Ethan saw something new. Not the look of someone beaten down, but of someone ready to fight. When night fell, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of wood smoke from nearby homes. Ethan stood on her porch, looking inside, at Jamie giggling while Myra cut the apple into little boat shapes. And in that moment, he understood more clearly than ever. This fight wasn't just against Walter. It was to protect nights like this, to keep a child's laughter from being stolen by cold hands hiding behind the word law. That morning, the fog was so thick you could barely make out the fence in front of Myra's place. Ethan stood on the porch, both hands wrapped around a hot mug of coffee, listening to the wind slip through the cracks in the doorframe. He was used to being up before the rest of the town, but today felt different, like the quiet was just waiting for someone to come and shatter it. Inside, Myra was making porridge for Jamie. The smell of fresh-cooked rice blended with warm apples drifted through the little kitchen, giving the place a kind of comfort you don't buy. It just lives there. Jamie sat at the table, still half asleep, holding a plastic spoon in one hand. through the doorway. Ethan caught the scene and thought about how, in all his years in uniform, he'd never dared to dream of something this ordinary. No gunfire, no urgent orders, just the breath of people you care about and the sound of a spoon tapping the edge of a bowl. They didn't make it through breakfast before the sound of an engine cut through the morning air. A black SUV rolled up to the curb, its tires crunching over gravel. Mira froze, the spoon still in her hand. Ethan moved toward the door, positioning himself so no one outside could see in. The driver's door opened, and Walter stepped out, gray overcoat, dark scarf wound tight. He didn't look at Ethan right away. His eyes swept over the small yard, like he was appraising every inch of it. "We need to talk," Walter said, his voice calm in a way that felt cold. Ethan didn't invite him in. He stepped down a few steps, keeping the space between them. "Say it here." Walter exhaled, a cloud of white disappearing into the chill. "Myra's making a mistake letting you near Jamie. A veteran with a medical file as thick as yours. No one knows what could happen if you lose control." Ethan didn't answer right away. He'd heard versions of this before, but this time it wasn't just about him. It was about Myra's right to keep her son. "If you really cared about that boy," Ethan said, slow and steady, "you'd have been here when he had a fever, instead of sitting in a meeting downtown figuring out how to take him from his mother." Walter's jaw tightened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I can make this end quietly. Mira gets enough money to leave town. You stay out of it." Ethan met his gaze, silent. Whatever Walter saw there told him this conversation wasn't going his way. He pressed his lips together, turned back toward the SUV. Before getting in, he said over his shoulder, "Don't think you can win. In this town, everything's still mine." The SUV pulled away, leaving the smell of exhaust tangled with the fog. Ethan went back inside. Mira was at the doorway, looking at him, waiting. He shook his head. "He wants you gone." Myra's hand gripped the doorframe. "I'm not leaving." Ethan stayed the rest of the day. They patched leaks in the porch roof, tightened the hinges on a loose window. Jamie played nearby, building a wooden block castle and glancing up now and then just to make sure they were both still there. Late in the afternoon, Clara stopped by with a large envelope. "This is a copy of the minutes from yesterday's meeting," she said, setting it on the table. "He's going for a temporary order to limit your custody. Claims it's an unstable environment and that you're under negative influence from someone outside the family." Mira read every line, her hand tightening around the paper. Ethan sat next to her, watching the change in her face. When she folded the document, her eyes were steadier than they'd been that morning. "Then we show them what an unstable environment really looks like," she said, her voice low but firm. Ethan nodded. This wasn't some flash of anger. This was a promise. He'd marched through places covered in mud and fog, but he'd never seen a path so clear. Protect Jamie, protect Myra's right to live in peace, no matter who stood against them. By the time Clara left, the sky was dark. The wind swept dried leaves down the street. Ethan stood on the porch again, looking through the window's warm light. Mira inside, tucking Jamie in, her face soft in the lamplight. And he knew, if it came down to choosing between his own safety and keeping that picture alive, there'd be no choice at all. That morning, the sky hung low and gray over the town, the kind of color that swallowed the tops of the grain silos and made the rooftops look damp even if the rain had stopped hours ago. The air carried that sharp, mineral smell of wet earth after a night of light rain, mixed with the faint smoke from someone's wood stove 2 streets over. Ethan was up earlier than usual, not out of habit, but because of a feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't panic, not yet. More like something coming closer, quiet and steady, the way fog slips under a doorframe without anyone noticing until it's already in the room. He stood in the kitchen, shoulders hunched slightly against the morning chill, pouring coffee into the old mug with the chipped rim. The mug had been in the house since before Mira moved in. One of those pieces that carried no real value except that it had always been there. He stood still a moment, listening for the small, uneven footsteps of Jamie crossing the wood floor upstairs. The house was so quiet he could hear the faint tick of the wall clock between drips from the coffee pot. Jamie padded in a minute later, still wearing his red and black checker pajamas, hair sticking out in wild tufts. He clutched his stuffed bear to his chest like a sentry on night duty. Without a word, the boy shuffled to the table, climbed onto a chair, and rubbed his eyes with the back of one hand. Ethan poured him a cup of warm milk, the steam curling into the air between them. The scene could have been lifted straight out of a life that belonged to someone else, peaceful, safe, but Ethan knew better. In a town like this, peace had a shelf life, and it usually expired the moment you stopped expecting trouble. Mira came in next, wearing a gray wool sweater that hung loose on her frame, sleeves pushed up just far enough to show the edge of her wristwatch. In her hand was a small paper bag. "I'm heading to the grocery store," she said, her voice still rough from a night of light sleep. "We're low on a few things." Ethan nodded, watching her pull the door shut behind her. He didn't answer out loud, but that low, uneasy hum in his chest tightened. Walter had made his intentions clear, and when a man like that set his mind on something, his first move was never loud. It was pressure you couldn't see until it was already on you. 15 minutes passed. Jamie was on the living room rug, bent over a puzzle, lips moving as he hunted for corner pieces. Then came a knock, slow, deliberate, on the front door. Ethan opened it to find Walter standing there, holding a thick brown envelope. His coat was bone dry. No beads of rain, no wet shoes. He'd been sitting in the car, waiting for the exact moment to strike. "Myra's not here," Ethan said, his voice flat. Walter extended the envelope like he was handing off a delivery that meant nothing to him. "Give this to her. Temporary hearing. 1 week from today. The court's reviewing custody of the boy." Ethan held his gaze but didn't touch the envelope right away. "You chose this instead of speaking to your daughter-in-law face to face." Walter's mouth twisted into a smile without warmth. "Face to face or not, it won't change the outcome. You're both just drawing out the inevitable." He set the envelope on the step, turned, and walked to his black SUV. The taillights flared, then faded into the gray. Ethan stayed at the doorway for a long moment, feeling the damp air on his face, before finally picking up the envelope and closing the door behind him. Jamie looked up from the puzzle, head tilted. "Just paperwork, kid," Ethan said, ruffling his hair. When Mira returned, she set the grocery bag on the counter. Ethan handed her the envelope without a word. She opened it, eyes scanning each line, and all the colors seemed to drain from her face. It wasn't a surprise. Walter had been circling them for weeks, but seeing it printed in black ink, stamped and dated, made it real in a way nothing else had. 7 days. A judge. Arguments boiled down to words on paper. "They'll say I'm not fit to raise him," she murmured, almost to herself. "They'll use every mistake, every weakness." Ethan sat across from her, elbows on the table. "Then we make sure they see the truth. All of it." They started that same afternoon. Clara came by with a manila folder stuffed with papers and an old voice recorder that still smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. "We need anything that proves she's a good mom," Clara said, scanning the kitchen like it might hold evidence. "Receipts for medicine, Jamie's medical files, anyone willing to vouch for her." Ethan disappeared into the back room and returned with a small, battered notebook, the kind soldiers kept in their breast pockets. He slid it across the table to Clara. Inside were neat lines of dates and notes, fevers, doses, doctor visits, each one marked in a steady, blocky hand. Clara flipped through a few pages and gave a short nod. "This is gold." The rest of the day turned into quiet work. Jamie sprawled on the floor, drawing shapes in a coloring book while the adults traded papers, made lists, and scribbled names of neighbors who might speak for Mira. Outside, the wind carried a faint metallic bite through the cracks in the doorframe, rattling the loose siding in the back. The house felt both fragile and determined, like a ship patched just enough to make it through another night's weather. By the time Jamie was asleep upstairs, the kitchen table was a map of their defense, files stacked in rows, sticky notes marking key points, Clara's handwriting crisscrossing Ethan's military-precise columns. Mira sat with her shoulders drawn tight, combing through another pile of documents. Each time she looked up, her eyes showed both exhaustion and something harder, the quiet grit of someone who had no choice but to keep going. Ethan stayed in the corner chair, sorting Clara's printouts into a binder, his movements slow but certain. He'd seen this rhythm before, not in courtrooms, but in staging tents and makeshift command posts overseas. Battles weren't always fought with rifles. Sometimes they were fought with paper, memory, and the refusal to leave someone behind. They had tomorrow mapped out, calls to witnesses, an appointment with Dr. Price for a formal statement, Clara digging deeper into county records. But for now, they let the silence stretch across the kitchen. It wasn't the heavy silence of fear, it was the stillness that comes when people have finally set their feet in the dirt and decided they're not moving. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt something thread its way into that stillness. It wasn't much, just a thin line of hope, like the warm glow from the little lamp on the table. Not bright enough to erase the dark, but steady enough to light the path they'd have to walk in the days ahead. The morning of the hearing came, and the town felt like it had been dusted with ash. No sunlight broke through the thick, heavy gray clouds. Just a pale, silver light slipping through the windows, quiet as a held breath. Everything seemed slower than usual. The sound of wheels on the street felt softer. The cafe door at the corner opened with an echo that lingered a little too long. It was as if the whole place was waiting for something unavoidable. Ethan woke before the alarm. Not because he was rested, but because thoughts of this morning had been pulling him from sleep since before dawn. He went down to the kitchen, started the coffee maker. The slow drip into the glass pot filled the room with that warm, bitter smell, but it wasn't enough to lift the weight in his chest. He set a cup of coffee in front of Mira, poured warm milk into a glass for Jamie. The boy sat in his high wooden chair, clutching a worn-out teddy bear to his chest. His eyes were still heavy with sleep. He didn't understand what was about to happen, only that his mother was dressed sharper than usual, and Ethan had on a pressed shirt he only wore for rare occasions. Mira held her cup with both hands, sipping in small, careful gulps. Her hands trembled slightly, her eyes fixed on the window, where the trees stood perfectly still. She looked like she was searching for an answer out there, or maybe just trying not to think about facing Walter in that courtroom. "It'll be all right," Ethan said in a low voice. Not like a promise, more like something you have to believe just to keep moving. Mira gave a small nod, but stayed quiet. She wore a dark dress, a light jacket, her hair pulled back. The way she checked her bag and straightened her papers had the focus of someone heading into a silent but tense battle. The sound of a familiar engine rolled into the yard. Clara's old car stopped out front. She got out without much talk, handing Mira a folder marked with color tabs. "I flagged the important parts," Clara said, her voice steady. "If they ask, speak slowly, clearly. Don't let Walter steer the conversation." The county courthouse sat at the end of Main Street, a red brick building weathered by time. The stone steps were worn down from decades of footsteps. Inside, the air was cold and dry, the smell of old paper mixing with floor wax, giving the place a distant, almost unwelcoming feel. Walter was already there. Sharp suit, dark tie, hair combed neat, posture confident. His eyes slid over Ethan and Mira without hiding the calculation behind them. Ethan didn't respond, just rested a hand on the back of the chair in front of him, holding himself steady. The hearing opened with the even, measured tone of the judge, a silver-haired man with tired but alert eyes. He read through the files, turning each page like he was checking a never-ending list. Walter spoke first, with the smooth delivery of someone used to winning arguments. He kept circling back to stable future, best resources for the child, a proper nurturing environment. Every phrase was designed to touch on fear, carefully avoiding mention of Mira as a person with her own efforts and worth. When it was her turn, Mira stood. At first her voice wavered, but each sentence grew steadier, clearer. She spoke about raising Jamie after her husband died, the nights he burned with fever, the time she rushed to the clinic alone in the cold rain, the simple but nourishing meals. Clara passed the judge Ethan's notebook, pages detailing every dose of medicine, every checkup, every fever broken. Dr. Harlan Price took the witness stand. His words were short, each one landing heavy. Jamie's been cared for well. His fragile health is from birth, not neglect. This mother's done everything necessary. Walter's brow tightened, though his face stayed composed. He tried to push back, but whenever his questions turned personal, the judge cut in with a firm, "Please stay within scope." When it was over, the judge said the decision would come in a few days. No answer yet, but for Mira, just making it through the morning on her feet was its own small victory. Outside, the sky was still gray, but it didn't press down the way it had earlier. Mira stopped on the courthouse steps, took a deep breath. Ethan stood beside her, saying nothing, just holding out his hand. She took it, her move this time like a thank you that didn't need words. Jamie darted ahead, teddy bear swinging, a small laugh breaking the quiet street. The sight eased something in Ethan, not because it was over, but because for now they were still together. Clara leaned against her car, a tired but warm smile on her face. "We'll wait," she said, "and I think they've seen the truth." Ethan looked from Mira to Jamie. A line from his army days came back to him. You don't have to win every battle, just the important ones. And he believed, today, they'd done exactly that. The car rolled slowly through the narrow streets, past rows of old wooden houses. The town stayed calm, as if it didn't know a family had just gone through a turning point. But to Ethan, every rooftop, every tree now held a piece of this story. And he knew he was staying, for as long as it took to protect it. There were no fireworks to close this chapter, no crowds in the street, no brass band. Just a quiet afternoon, the kind where the light tilts softer and the air smells faintly of warm dust and leaves. The road home lay under a canopy of trees, their branches swaying slow in the breeze, throwing mottled shadows across the worn pavement. Ethan's boots found their own rhythm against the gravel, the sound folding into the wind until it felt like the earth itself was walking them home. At the door, he rested his hand on the weathered wood for a beat before pushing it open. The hinge gave its familiar soft creak, a sound he'd heard 1,000 times, each one telling him he was in the right place. Jamie darted in first, sock feet sliding a little on the floorboards, his laughter trailing off into the hallway. Mira followed, the late-day sun catching in her hair for just a moment before the door closed behind them. In the small kitchen, the warmth from a boiling kettle spread outward, fogging a corner of the old window. The scent of herbal tea mixed with the buttery sweetness of fresh toast. It wasn't grand. It wasn't much. But it was theirs. No one spoke about the court, or the lawyer's sharp questions, or the weight of fear that had sat on all their chests for weeks. Those things had been left outside, with the dust and the dying light. Here, they stayed in the moment, a family gathered at a table, imperfect in every way, but intact. Ethan leaned back in his chair, glancing through the window. Beyond the glass, the line of trees swayed like they were breathing. The army had taught him how to stand still under fire, how to keep moving when the noise was deafening. But it was here, in the hush of this kitchen, that he learned the harder lesson, how to protect peace once you'd found it. Maybe we're all coming back from some kind of war. Not always with smoke in the air or lines drawn in the dirt. Sometimes it's the long, uneventful days where you fight to keep hold of something fragile, believing in it even when no one promises you'll come out ahead. And maybe victory isn't loud. Maybe it's a cup of tea you didn't have to drink alone, or the sound of a child's footsteps upstairs, or the quiet knowledge that, for now, everyone you love is under the same roof. If you've ever had a moment like that, a small, ordinary second that anchored you, that told you you'd finally made it to where you needed to be, tell me. Write it down. Say out loud. You never know. Your story might be the map for someone still out there, trying to find their way home.